After 9 years of sacrifice, my own family saw me as nothing more than a loser. The truth hit me like a punch in the dark. I'm Lisa, 29, and I've spent the last 9 years in an endless cycle of caretaking, sacrificing everything I could have been to support a family that's only taken my efforts for granted. It all began when I was 20, just a bright-eyed sophomore studying psychology. I'd planned to become a clinical psychologist partly because of the therapist who helped me through my dad's death when I was a kid. I had this vision of making a difference, of offering the same kind of solace to others that I'd once received. At school, I was doing well. I had good friends, a part-time job, and a plan to study abroad the following year. But one phone call from my mom turned my life upside down. She'd been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder that left her in chronic pain, attacking her joints and muscles until even basic movements were excruciating. The doctor said it was progressive. There was no cure. At that time, my younger brother Tom was 15, still in high school and more interested in video games than responsibilities. After Dad died, it had always been just the three of us, and Mom had worked tirelessly as a legal secretary to make ends meet. But now, she was too sick to keep her job. I remember sitting alone in my dorm room, textbooks strewn across my desk, heart pounding as I faced the choice ahead of me. Dropping out of college to take care of Mom and Tom wasn't something I'd planned for, but it seemed like the only way. Tom was too young to take on that burden, and Mom needed constant help. The idea of leaving college crushed me, but I couldn't see any other option. The next day, I went to the registrar's office and withdrew from my courses, ignoring the academic advisor's attempts to change my mind. I got my first job as a receptionist at a small accounting firm that didn't require a degree. The pay was meager, but it was enough to help with bills and Mom's growing medical expenses. Moving back home wasn't what I'd wanted, but I convinced myself it was only temporary, a bridge to a brighter future once Mom's condition stabilized and Tom graduated high school. Those early months were agonizing. I'd gone from engaging in lectures and late-night study sessions to answering phones and filing papers in a small, sterile office. At night, I'd help Mom with her physical therapy, trying to soothe her pain and cheer her up. She'd often say, "You'll go back to school soon enough, Lisa. I'll be better by then." But as time passed, those words felt more and more like a hopeful lie. Still, I held on to the thought that one day I'd return to college. I worked hard, earning a modest promotion to administrative assistant, which increased my salary just enough to cover our essential expenses. Over time, I became Tom's primary provider, buying his clothes, school supplies, and even pitching in for college applications. I couldn't give him the life I'd dreamed of for myself, but I was determined that at least he'd have a chance. Watching him succeed felt like my own small victory. When Tom got his college acceptance letter, we celebrated with ice cream, just as our parents had done when we were kids. My own dreams of school and career faded further into the background, but I convinced myself that everything I gave up was worth it, just to see him happy. Yet, as Tom settled into college, a change began. His calls grew sparse, and when he did reach out, it was usually to ask for money. When I checked his social media, I saw photos of parties and spring break trips, all those pieces of life I'd missed. The bond between us began to feel like a loose thread fraying, pulling away with each unanswered call. When he came home for holidays, he barely spoke to me or Mom, preferring to see his old friends. Our connection, once close, felt like it was slipping through my fingers. Then there was Mom. Though her condition stabilized somewhat, she remained reliant on me, and our relationship strained under that weight. She rarely acknowledged the sacrifices I'd made. When she did comment, it was to complain or hint that I should be doing more. Sometimes she'd compare me to other daughters, saying how lucky they were to have someone more dedicated. I'd look at her then, feeling like a ghost, present but unseen. But still, I kept pushing through, clinging to that hope that one day my efforts would be recognized. And then Tom's graduation day came. I'd saved for months to buy him a good watch. Nothing extravagant, but enough to say, "I'm proud of you." When I handed him the gift, though, he barely acknowledged me before rejoining his friends. Mom didn't seem to notice, too busy boasting about how successful he would be and how he'd finally be able to take care of us. And then, in the midst of that bustling crowd, I heard him. I heard Tom say to his friends how ashamed he was of his loser family. He said he couldn't wait to cut us off, to finally escape our pitiful lives. Those words shattered me. Every sleepless night, every dollar saved, every part of myself I'd sacrificed over the years. I'd done it all for someone who now looked at me with nothing but scorn. My brother, my own flesh and blood, was calling me a loser. I held back my tears, kept my silence, and left that celebration without a word. The next day, I confronted him, hoping against all odds that he might apologize. But instead, he lashed out, mocking me for giving up on my dreams, saying he'd never asked me to do any of it, and that I was simply pathetic. Mom, overhearing, sided with him, accusing me of ruining his big moment. I felt like my world was collapsing, my sacrifices a forgotten relic in the life they now wanted to leave behind. When Tom left, I was left alone with Mom's harsh words echoing in my ears. She told me I should be grateful for his success, that I was too dramatic. I spent days after that in a daze, questioning everything, wondering if my life had been worth anything at all. I thought of the career I'd abandoned, the friends I'd lost touch with, the places I'd never gone. I was 29, without a degree, without a life outside of the empty shell of our family home. I felt like I'd wasted my life. I imagined what could have been if I'd pursued my degree, if I'd become that psychologist I'd once dreamed of being. I could have had a career, friends, maybe even a family of my own. But now, all I had were fading memories and a gnawing emptiness. The question loomed larger each day. Should I finally leave and start over? Or was it too late? After those final blows from Tom and Mom, I couldn't keep ignoring my own needs. For years, I'd convinced myself that sacrificing everything was noble, that it would bring my family closer. But that night, alone in my room, I faced the truth. They didn't see my sacrifices as love. They saw them as my duty, an expectation. I realized I had to choose myself, maybe for the first time in my life. I decided to confront Mom and Tom directly, hoping that an honest conversation could clear the air and maybe bring some understanding. I spent days practicing, trying to find words that could convey my pain without anger. I invited Tom over for a family dinner and made Mom's favorite lasagna, hoping a warm meal might soften them both. When we sat down, I started by explaining how deeply I felt the weight of everything I'd sacrificed over the years. Not just dropping out of college, but the countless little things I'd given up. The trips, the friendships, the dreams. I poured out every bottled-up feeling, my voice shaky but calm, hoping they'd understand how empty and unappreciated I felt. But my words fell flat. Mom's face hardened, and she became defensive, claiming I was just trying to guilt-trip her. "I didn't ask you to give up college," she said sharply. "I never wanted to get sick and ruin your life, Lisa." She even compared me to her own mother, who had taken care of her sick father without a single complaint. I tried to explain that I wasn't blaming her for her illness. I only wanted her to acknowledge my sacrifices, just once. But my words only seemed to anger her more. Then there was Tom. He just sat there, barely glancing at me, poking at his plate, looking annoyed rather than remorseful. When I brought up the cruel things he'd said at his graduation party, he didn't deny them. Instead, he shrugged, muttering, "Well, it's true, isn't it? You're kind of a loser." His words cut through me like ice. I asked him how he could say such things after everything I'd done for him. He rolled his eyes and responded, "Here we go with the guilt trip again." I looked at Mom, hoping she'd defend me, but she remained silent. She even went as far as to say I was being too sensitive and that Tom didn't mean it that way. But I could see it in his eyes. He meant every word. He then started listing all of his accomplishments, flaunting his degree, his job offer, his plans to move to the city, as if to contrast his success against my stagnant life. "What have you done with your life?" he said. "You're almost 30, still living at home, working as a secretary. It's pathetic." I couldn't hold back my tears. Choking on my words, I reminded Tom of every late night I'd spent helping him with homework, the money I'd saved to buy him new clothes for college, and the time I'd sacrificed for him. "Did any of that mean anything to you?" I asked. Tom stood up, looking at me with disdain. and said he was done with this toxic family drama. Then he stormed out, leaving his untouched dinner behind. Once he was gone, Mom turned on me. She accused me of being selfish for making everything about myself when she was the one suffering the most. "You're the one turning him against me," she yelled. Her words broke me completely. I'd held on my role as caretaker for so long, but now I saw it wasn't out of love, it was out of obligation. Mom had convinced herself that she was the only one hurting and that my life, my dreams, were nothing more than collateral damage. She even told me that if I was so unhappy, maybe I should just leave. So I did. That night, I packed a bag and went to my friend Qley's place. Qley, who had been my closest friend since high school, had watched me give up every part of myself for my family. She'd been my only constant, the only person who understood what I'd been through. When I showed up at her door, she welcomed me with open arms, letting me cry and vent until the early hours of the morning. The next day, I returned home to pack more of my belongings. The decision to leave, although painful, felt right. Mom, realizing I was serious, became frantic. She tried everything from guilt-tripping me with comments about my father being disappointed in me to claiming that she'd never survive without me. But I held my ground. I knew I couldn't go back. I suggested she look into home health aides or ask her sister for help, but she dismissed the idea, saying she couldn't trust strangers like she trusted me. But I couldn't let her needs chain me to a life where I was unappreciated. Packing was surreal. Each item I touched brought a wave of memories, a life I'd never fully lived. My old psychology textbooks, the photos from family vacations, the tiny reminders of a life that once held so much promise. I felt both sadness and relief as I closed up the last box. For the first time in years, I was making a choice for myself. At Qley's, life took on a new rhythm. She'd made room for me in her small apartment, and every evening felt like a luxury. No more rushing to help Mom, no more Tom's scorn. I'd sit by the window, breathing in the quiet, still feeling pangs of guilt, but also an overwhelming sense of freedom. It was both terrifying and thrilling to realize I had time now, time to think about my future, my dreams. I even looked into classes at the local community college, daring to consider finishing my degree. Mom's calls came constantly at first, her texts shifting from anger to desperation, asking me to come home, even pleading. But after weeks of guilt and anguish, I blocked her number. Tom reached out only once, not to apologize, but to ask if I'd help Mom move some furniture. When I refused, he responded with bitterness, calling me selfish. I hung up and blocked his number too, unwilling to let him back in if he could only cause pain. I wasn't entirely alone, though. I found solace in my relationship with Aunt Rachel, my mom's sister, who I'd always admired growing up. One day, I ran into her at the grocery store, and she asked me why I hadn't been answering Mom's calls. I hesitated but then explained the situation, feeling unsure of how she'd react. But Rachel was understanding. She confided in me that she'd always thought it was unfair that I'd shouldered so much responsibility. "You've done enough, Lisa," she told me, and it felt like a balm on an old wound. She even offered to help with Mom, so I could take a real break. As the weeks went by, I started to feel a sense of clarity and strength I hadn't known before. I enrolled in a psychology class at the community college and started seeing a therapist to work through my feelings. With every session, I untangled years of guilt, learning that I had worth beyond my family's needs. I began to see myself as more than a caretaker, a loser, or a pathetic figure in Tom's narrative. I was Lisa, someone who still had dreams worth chasing. After a month of living with Qley, the guilt began to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. The freedom of having my own time, my own choices, was something I'd forgotten existed. I settled into a routine with Qley, cooking dinner together, watching movies on weekends. She encouraged me to reconnect with parts of myself I'd neglected for years. Slowly, I was learning to enjoy life without feeling that familiar, crushing guilt. Returning to school was one of my biggest steps forward. I enrolled in 2 classes, psychology and English composition. Walking into that first classroom, I was a bundle of nerves, feeling too old and out of place. But as it turned out, Many of the students were adults like me, coming back after years away. I felt more focused than ever, finding myself genuinely excited to study again. Diving into discussions on psychological theories, I felt my old passion reignite, as though that younger, hopeful version of myself was coming back to life. For the first time in almost a decade, I felt proud of myself. Managing school, work, and a budding social life was challenging, but it was a new, invigorating kind of stress, one that motivated me to keep pushing forward. I even joined a study group with some classmates, which offered both academic support and a much-needed social connection. With every passing day, I felt myself regaining confidence, redefining who I was beyond the caretaker role. I was learning to set boundaries and recognize that my worth wasn't tied to the sacrifices I'd made. I also decided to see a therapist. Talking with someone neutral allowed me to confront years of unresolved feelings. She helped me understand why I'd felt so compelled to sacrifice everything for my family and taught me how to care for others without losing myself. Therapy was difficult at times, forcing me to relive painful memories and confront parts of myself I'd avoided, but it was also liberating. With each session, I felt lighter, like I was finally shedding the weight I'd carried for so long. The situation with my family remained complicated. At first, Mom continued reaching out, sending alternating messages that ranged from anger to desperation. She'd text things like, "You're selfish for abandoning your sick mother," and then, "Please come home. I need you." I kept my boundary firm, not responding. Eventually, the messages stopped. Then one day, Tom messaged me, but it wasn't an apology. Instead, he asked if I'd help move furniture for Mom. When I politely declined, suggesting he could help her instead, his response was an angry accusation, calling me selfish. His words stung, but I was done allowing them to manipulate me. Without further thought, I blocked his number as well. To my surprise, Aunt Rachel became a source of support I hadn't anticipated. I ran into her by chance at the grocery store, and she asked why I hadn't been answering Mom's calls. Unsure of how she'd react, I briefly explained what had happened. Rachel listened with a sympathetic nod, then surprised me by admitting that she'd always thought my family had placed too much pressure on me. She shared that she'd gone through a similar struggle with her own mother years ago, needing to set boundaries for her mental health. "You've given enough, Lisa," she said, reaching out to pat my arm. "It's time for you to live your own life." For the first time, I felt validated by someone in my family. Aunt Rachel even offered to help with Mom, so the burden wouldn't rest on me alone. My newfound freedom also extended to my career. I'd been working the same administrative job for years, but now I was eager for change. I began applying for roles that felt more aligned with my interests. A few weeks later, I interviewed for an entry-level HR position at a nonprofit. I walked in nervously, but left feeling optimistic. The work involved supporting underprivileged youth, a cause close to my heart and rooted in my interest in psychology. When they called to offer me the job, I felt like I was finally moving forward, carving out a life I could be proud of. Each day brought new experiences and challenges, but I approached them with fresh resolve. Living with Qley continued to be a breath of fresh air, her friendship an anchor as I navigated this uncharted territory. She encouraged me to go out, socialize, and try things I'd never had the time or energy for. I joined her for a yoga class, attended local meetups, and even started making new friends. Bit by bit, I was building a life that felt meaningful and complete. As for my family, they still loomed in the background, but I was learning to manage those emotions with healthier boundaries. One evening, Aunt Rachel invited me over for dinner, saying she wanted to catch up. When I arrived, I was surprised and a little anxious to see Mom there too. Aunt Rachel, it turned out, had arranged this meeting, hoping to help us reconcile. I nearly walked out, but decided to stay, even if only to get some closure. The dinner began tense and awkward, with Mom avoiding eye contact. As the evening wore on, though, she finally started to open up. She admitted, haltingly, that she'd taken me for granted, and that she feared losing me entirely. She even mentioned that she'd started seeing a therapist herself, trying to confront her own issues. It was a small step, but it felt significant. I told her, honestly, that I needed more time and space, but that perhaps we could start reconnecting in small, supervised visits with Aunt Rachel present. Mom agreed, though I could see the sadness in her eyes. Leaving that night, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. I knew our relationship was still fractured, but this was a step, a chance to rebuild something, even if it looked very different from before. The truth was I was still healing, still learning to prioritize my own needs. My life was just beginning to take shape outside the bounds of family duty, and I wasn't about to give that up. I could now imagine a future for myself, one filled with friends, a meaningful career, and maybe someday love. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real, and it was mine. 3 months passed since I'd left my old life behind, and each day felt like a new chapter. Getting the HR position at the nonprofit was a turning point. I finally had work that felt meaningful. Every morning, I walked into the office with a sense of purpose, knowing I was helping create programs for youth in need. I had supportive coworkers who valued my input and encouraged me to grow. For the first time in years, my hard work was appreciated, and that validation fueled my passion. School continued to go well too. I was on track to complete my associate's degree by next year, and my plan was to transfer to a 4-year university to finish my bachelor's in psychology. Balancing school and work wasn't easy, but I'd grown to love the challenge. I felt stronger and more resilient, embracing this second chance with everything I had. Living with Qley became a blessing I hadn't expected. We grew closer, and she kept encouraging me to step outside my comfort zone. One night, she invited me to a local meetup for young professionals, where I met people who shared my interests and goals. It felt strange but wonderful to be forming connections outside the context of my family. I was learning to enjoy life again, to laugh, to be spontaneous. My relationship with Aunt Rachel grew deeper as well. She became a source of wisdom and reassurance, always reminding me that I deserved a life where my needs mattered. We'd have coffee once a week, and each time, I'd leave feeling uplifted. She checked in on Mom and would share small updates, careful to respect my boundaries. I didn't ask much, knowing I needed time to heal before fully reopening that door. And then, one evening, Aunt Rachel invited me for dinner again, telling me she wanted to talk about Mom. Reluctantly, I agreed, trusting her, but feeling apprehensive. When I arrived, Aunt Rachel explained that Mom had been struggling more lately, both physically and emotionally. Apparently, therapy was helping her recognize her past behavior, and she was working on understanding the strain her illness had put on me. Aunt Rachel suggested that perhaps, in time, I might consider reconnecting with Mom more regularly, but only if I felt ready. Her words stirred conflicting emotions. Part of me still felt hurt, but there was also a small flicker of hope that maybe things could improve. I wasn't ready to fully forgive or forget, but knowing Mom was trying gave me some closure. I told Aunt Rachel I was open to occasional visits, but only if she could be there too. She agreed, and I felt relieved, knowing I could set boundaries while slowly exploring a new kind of relationship with Mom. As for Tom, he had moved across the country for a new job, and our contact was minimal. His last message had been brief, wishing me luck and telling me he hoped I'd get my act together. I hadn't responded. It was painful to accept that our once close relationship might never be the same, but I was also learning that I couldn't control how others chose to see me. I had to focus on my own healing, not on trying to change anyone's perspective. As the months passed, I grew more confident in my choices. With therapy, I confronted lingering feelings of guilt and shame, learning to accept that I could care for others without sacrificing myself entirely. I began to believe that I was worthy of the life I'd always dreamed of, one filled with joy, purpose, and balance. Then one evening, Qley and I decided to celebrate. We'd both reached milestones. She'd received a promotion, and I'd completed another semester with high grades. We went to a little Italian restaurant, laughing and reminiscing over wine and pasta. As we talked about our dreams for the future, I realized just how far I'd come. I was no longer haunted by what I'd left behind. Instead, I was excited about what lay ahead. Reflecting on my journey, I felt immense gratitude. I was grateful for Aunt Rachel's support, for Qley's friendship, and for my own resilience. The sacrifices I'd made hadn't been in vain. They taught me strength, patience, and compassion. But now I was finally ready to invest that energy into myself. I knew there would still be difficult days, moments of doubt, but I also knew that I had the tools to face them.